So, traditional Jewish, Christian, or Muslim.
Atheist and agnostic as well.
One of us. One of us. One of us. One of us. I've been planning that opening
I like it.
all week. Because today we're talking about dun dun dun.
Cults. The danger religions.
Ooh, I like that.
From talking to people, that seems to be like the big difference between cults and religions. Of course, scholarly discussion has no use for that definition, but
We'll get into that in just a minute. We thought this would be a good topic today because we spent last episode talking about belief and how people believe things more than why people believe things. How belief is a
super complicated thing.
Psychological function and a philosophical debate.
It's so complicated.
So complicated.
But I love it.
So we thought we'd make it more complicated by discussing why people believe weird things. There's a lot of weird stuff out there. Do we maybe want to start with talking about why people get involved in cults to begin with, and then, or do we want to start with talking about what a cult actually is?
Well, see, like religions, or the idea of religion, it's very hard to define in a way where you aren't cutting out things that do belong or including things that don't belong.
Yeah.
And cults has that exact same problem. The word cult is too nebulous. It's too tricky. I've got a couple of ideas that are helpful for that discussion for defining the word, but I don't think that they're solid definitions on their own either.
I found some definitions that I pointed out to you that I actually didn't like because you're right. There's so many exceptions to the rule that, maybe let's start with those three and I can tell you why I don't like them.
Let's start with what you got, yeah.
If you want to debunk any, if you have any rebuttals, I'd love to hear them.
Sure.
The definitions I found break down the difference between a church, a sect, and a cult. And again, I don't like any of these. So number one, a church is a conventional religious organization. Please go see episode 2.
What counts as conventional?
Right? Even big recognized religions have some really weird beliefs. So what's the definition of conventional then?
Yeah, like half of the words in this definition are no good. Conventional is entirely subjective. Religious, we've talked about this. We don't have a solid definition on that. And organization.
Sure, I'll let organization pass.
I mean,
that's about it.
There's a general consensus on what that word means, but when it's applied to religious organizations, there's a wide variety on how organized they are.
Well, we just talked about Shinto. There really isn't any organization in Shinto.
Exactly.
So, anyway, so that one was already...
Definition, no good.
This is me crumpling up paper, but mouth noises. A sect is a deviant religious organization with traditional beliefs and practices. So again, every word in this is like
there's
so
problems.
Strange.
Most people that start sects think that the group from which they have separated themselves has deviated and that they're realigning themselves with the correct path. But that's usually the argument.
But when we look at something as vast and Christianity, I think, is going to get picked on quite a bit this episode.
For sure.
When we look at something like Christianity, arguably has hundreds of sects that have broken off from the original, religion that Peter founded in, the first century.
Yeah.
So does that mean that the Anabaptists are a sect? Does that mean that Lutherans are a sect? Does that mean the Orthodox Church is a sect? No, I wouldn't look at these and think they're deviant organizations. We call them denominations now.
But if you're a Catholic, as opposed to a religious scholar, absolutely, every single one of these groups counts as a sect.
Oh,
a
and I mean,
being
even if
deviant.
you're a Lutheran, you'd think anything that came after that would be a sect.
A deviant group. Yeah.
Yeah. But, I don't think your average North American looks at the Pentecostals and go, that's a deviant Christian sect. You just, you're a Pentecostal. Okay.
Yeah.
And now cults. And I even have a problem with this one. A cult is a deviant religious organization with novel beliefs and practices. Which again,
What's novel?
we had this conversation in a previous episode. I don't even remember which, but all religions, even developed religions, sprout from existing religions. So there's no religion out there today with novel beliefs and practices. I shouldn't say no. I'm sure there's one or two kicking around, but anything that gets any sort of traction is not novel. And if we look at some of the big, dangerous, scary cults, and we'll talk in more detail a little bit today, and then we'll do full episodes later on. But the Branch Davidians, they're part of the Seventh-day Adventists. Jim Jones, I don't know. He was a Christian preacher. I don't know what denomination of Christianity he was. The Rajneeshis, which we'll get into, they're a branch of Hinduism. It's not novel.
Right. They take ideas that may have been outside of their previously existent religious faith tradition and incorporate them, and that usually alienates them from another group. So where they need to become a new separate group, yeah, that's not a novel thing. Maybe novel to that tradition, but it's not a new idea.
Or they put different focus on different aspects of, right?
Absolutely.
So even Seventh-day Adventists, as if we want to call them a sect of Christianity, they focus on the seventh day more than other groups might.
Right. They're just a subset of the Adventist movement that may not focus on the seventh day, but having Christ come back on the eighth day.
Jehovah Witnesses and the 200,000 people, which is based off of 144,000 people based off the 12 tribes of Israel, right?
Yeah.
They just have a particular focus on this little piece of their book.
Yep. Specifically excluding those from the tribe of Dan.
Oh.
The Revelation is an interesting book, and the things that people like to highlight in it are really a fun way to explore how people have dangerous prejudices.
Yeah. One thing I want to point out this episode is that all asterisks, because actually I did find someone that argued this point, all religions start as cults.
Pretty much. I mean, from the scholarly point of view of what a cult is, like even Judaism,
absolutely,
it's known historically as the cult of Yahweh or the cult of Israel. That was their unifying faith, and the word cult is used a lot differently in scholarly discourse than it is in common language.
One of the definitions I see pop up is a group of fervent or zealous leaders, believers rallying around a charismatic leader. So Jesus
was pretty charismatic.
Muhammad?
Oh, for sure. And they rallied around them. So that fits.
Martin Luther, Henry VIII. Yeah. So all these.
L. Ron Hubbard.
That one. So I think we have to be careful how we toss around the term cult, both from, a scholarly perspective. We have to be clear when we're talking about it under scholarly terms, like when we said Christianity started as a cult. And also when we're talking about it in the more common connotation of a dangerous group.
Absolutely.
I think we have to be clear. I think sometimes cult is tossed around too loosely for sure. And we'll get into an example later on of when it's not actually dangerous. It's just maybe a new or different belief group. And then we label it a cult. And anyway, maybe it shouldn't be labeled cult.
The most useful, and how useful it is still tricky, definition that applies to the common use of the word cult as opposed to the scholarly use of the word would be a group that is led by somebody who doesn't believe what he teaches, but teaches to get gain.
Interesting. I like that one.
The trick is, as we talked about belief, it's hard enough to nail down what you actually know as an individual. It is impossible to say with any certainty what somebody else truly believes apart from measuring their actions against what they say.
I agree.
It's very complicated.
But last week we were talking about the CES letter. And definitely reading it, part of me was like, how many of the elders in the church really believe and how many of there are in for gain? Or like at what point, or maybe they believe to a point and now they have all the information because they have access to all. And do they still believe or do they not believe, but they're in a position of power so they stay? And I wonder that for the Catholic Church too. It was just that, the CES letter was top of mind last week.
I think it's a perfectly valid question. A question that you're not likely to get a solid answer for.
No, of course not, because they would never, I wouldn't say they'd never be truthful, but if they were there just for power, they wouldn't be truthful.
Right.
If they truly believed, everyone's going to tell you they believe. So you can't weed that out.
The only thing you have to go on is measuring their actions against their words.
Yeah. One definition I saw of a cult is a group that you're scared to leave. And I actually like that definition.
It's pretty strong. I like it.
Because some cults aren't religious based. I would say when you get to the act of sort of this fervent level of belief, obviously it is.
It has become religious.
It has become religious, but they don't all start that way. The most contemporary and still very newsworthy example is Nexium.
Oh, for sure.
It was a self-help premise. Nothing religious about it. They do have a charismatic leader, but people weren't joining to get some divine revelation. They were joining for improvement and self-growth. And then it got really weird.
Absolutely. A friend of ours, I was talking to him earlier this week, and we were ribbing him a little bit that a self-help group that he belongs to sounds a little bit culty. But
is it Amway?
It's not Amway. It's not a marketing thing, though multi-level marketing schemes can be very culty.
Yep.
The one he belongs to sounds like it's on the up and up to me. Not that I'm jumping to join it, but he assured us that, yeah, they'd love to have you stay, but nobody is really pressured to stay. And it helps that there's nothing outside themselves that they need to believe in, which I think is actually really nice. But that people are free to keep taking more and more courses or leave at any time. And that's definitely, like you said, the fear of leaving is how you can pretty reliably put that line of where is it a cult?
Yeah. How do people get involved in cults?
Usually through friends.
I meant more from an epistological sense, but sure, our friends are dicks. Don't listen to your friends. No. Yes, from a thought belief place, especially, Jim Jones literally had hundreds of people kill themselves. Or,
sounds insane.
More accurately, yes, they drank. It was murder. He murdered hundreds of people. How do we go from this is a nice church to go to drinking poison flavorade?
Well, either at the beginning of it, somebody is keeping secret their nefarious plot, or they go crazy partway through this path. And so the trick is, how did you get to be part of this group that went insane? Usually it starts with being told things that you already believe. And I would say people are a lot more familiar with the idea of political cults today.
Yes, absolutely.
Like, say, the 3%ers, the 3% militia that's down in the States. Things like that, where they'll tell you things that don't sound crazy. They sound like things that you already believe or are immediately adjacent to something you believe. So they're totally digestible and acceptable. And you usually stew in that pot for a little while with new things being added every now and then that are adjacent to what you already believe. So they're acceptable and digestible. And over time, eventually you've come to a place where you are believing something that you weren't believing before at all, and is probably at variance with what you used to believe. And if you had the opportunity to see yourself from without, you would definitely notice that you have joined a cult.
Mm-hmm. A couple of things that are common, that's not the word I want to look for, are the same.
Common.
For people who end up in cults. And if you watch any sort of documentaries, YouTube videos, read any books on people who join cults, they're pretty normal people. They're doctors and teachers and lawyers and regular people in the community. Cults often target people when they're vulnerable, and cults actually prefer mentally healthy people in a vulnerable moment of their lives as opposed to people who are mentally unhealthy, because people who are mentally unhealthy are unstable. Whereas if you get someone who's typically mentally healthy and is going through some sort of crisis, maybe they've lost their job or their girlfriend broke up with them, or this blip on the radar, that's the perfect point to have someone join a cult.
Most religions that are evangelical will also play along those lines as well. If you're looking for people to join at a point where they're at a crossroads, is the time to do it. It's not just the danger religions.
I know. I want to say something that you might also want off the record, but you know how we got our Book of Mormon, right? There is so as Preston was saying, they don't give you all the details when you join. They make it sound awesome and light and fluffy, and at a point in your life where you want to be in a community, or I think it's a desire for everyone to want to be part of something bigger than themselves. That's why I like theater so much. Not that I do anything with theater, but that's why I like going to the theater.
We have a drive in ourselves naturally that we need to belong to a group.
Yeah.
And the antisocial among us that think that they're the exception typically just flock to a different way of organizing. And very few people actually are truly happy and flourish when they're alone.
Yeah. As we know from this pandemic.
Right.
Another tactic is love bombing. It is an abusive relationship tactic if you are being love bombed.
How do you know if you're being love bombed?
I think it'd probably be really hard to know if you're being love bombed, to be completely honest, because it's you at a vulnerable state, and it is the act of showing excessive amounts of affection and attention in a way to influence or manipulate behavior. So I think, that's not helpful if you're listening, but just knowing love bombing is a practice. If you're unsure, talk to someone you trust or a therapist, because it is abuse to shower someone with love with the plans to manipulate them. But that's, again, you find someone at a vulnerable state, you love on them hard, and they're more likely to do what you want them to do.
It's, like I mentioned before, it's almost impossible to know what is somebody else's head.
Yeah.
But sometimes you can catch little clues on when somebody is deliberately showering you with love and then deliberately withholding it.
Yeah.
And usually love bombing is cyclical, doing both of those things. It's cyclical, doing both of those things. And it's a good way. Good is the wrong word. It's a reliable and proven method of gaining control of people.
Yeah. I have two other points for reasons people join /
Do
stay in cults. I guess we'll start with this one is at some point after you're kind of in, there is the mob mentality, hive mind, social pressure piece. And I think that's how you can add pieces that, like you're talking about these adjacent pieces that maybe you didn't believe it, but now it's being introduced to you. And I think the social pressure makes it easier to accept, or at least you less likely to speak out. I kind of liken it to your first drink at a high school party, right? Everyone else is drinking. They're fine. They're saying, come on, do it. And you kind of go, okay, what's it? Even if you're uncomfortable, you know, chances are.
Peer pressure is the weirdest thing that outside of the moment, most people seem to believe that, oh, no,
I could say no.
I would recognize peer pressure and I'll say no when I want to say no. And then when you're in the moment, it's a lot more of a, oh, I wasn't prepared for this.
Yeah.
I will it's usually a self-protection thing. I will protect myself from what will be emotional harm by just doing what everyone expects.
It's interesting that being ostracized by a group it's probably like wired into our brains. It's totally wired into our brains, is more painful to us than actually putting ourselves in harm's way.
Yeah, even if you're not fully committed to the group, but even if you already see problems with the group, being ostracized from that group still hurts. It's such a weird thing.
Yeah, it takes a long time to not give a fuck.
Yeah.
I've done it a few times in my life, but it's never fun.
Right.
And last but not least, and I think this one isn't actually talked about a lot. I didn't actually find any notes on it, but I was thinking about it while I was making the notes, is the sunk cost fallacy. This is actually an economic...
it's a gambling kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like this slot machine has to pay out because I've been dumping quarters into it for days.
You learn about it in Economics 101 in, a sunk cost is like, I don't know, I paid for some advertising and it didn't work. Well, it's a sunk cost now. You move on, right? You cut your losses and move on instead of trying to make your advertising work. You go, okay, it didn't work and move on. The problem with the sunk cost fallacy is, again, I think we're kind of wired to believe that
somebody's going to notice how much effort I've put into this work.
Or, it's like at some point it has to work, right? Because so maybe just a little bit more money or a little bit more time or whatever, and I'll get my returns.
Come on, podcast, please work out.
Right? Maybe just one more episode. And we'll make it big. And you'll leave a 5-star review on Apple. But that's exactly it. And it's hard for people to cut those ties and go, okay, well, this didn't work and I've sunk in tens of thousands of dollars without getting a return. So that's an important thing to keep in mind as well. Just
Absolutely.
with anything. Is it a sunk cost? Evaluate that. Lots of things in life could be a sunk cost. So if you're concerned about leaving anything because of the time you've put in, if it's not working for you, get rid of it.
Yeah, never evaluate your efforts looking backwards when trying to decide whether or not you need to move forward.
Yeah. You
need to look at the rewards, not your efforts.
Yes. And I think a really good example, this is kind of off topic, but a good example is marriage, right? People go, well, I've been with him for 20 years. Well, you're unhappy. So what does 20 years matter?
Right.
You
Break
still
it
got
off,
20
go get
years
happy.
left easily.
Or more, hopefully.
Or more, probably. I'm like doing the math on how old you'd have to be if you're married. Yeah. If you're married at 25, you'd be 45. You got 40 years left. So, like, don't be miserable because you sunk 20 years into it. Or jobs are another big one.
Oh, for sure.
So that's a good, if you're trying to wrap your head around sunk cost, those are two good examples. So that's why people join and stay in cults.
It's kind of a bummer to have to think about all these negatives. there's not a whole lot of positivity in this episode, so we'll try and keep it light, but we're going to be dealing with some serious issues here.
Yeah, cults are, in the case that we're mostly talking about today, as in the negative, dangerous cults.
So, yeah, cults are obviously a problem. Anything that hurts you is a problem, and that's the big thing that is visible about cults, is that they hurt people. The trick is finding out that they're cults before they hurt people.
Which is hard because the members aren't going to talk to outsiders.
Right.
I think it's just regular cult education like this.
Yeah.
On knowing when you're vulnerable and some of these red flags. We're later in the episode going to get into red flags if you think someone you love is in a cult. But it really is individuals being educated, because you're right, nobody can know what's going on in your head. You might not share that you're feeling vulnerable, and you might not share that you've joined this new group of friends that
it's weird how
slaughter
many people...
goats every Thursday night.
There's not a whole lot of bloodshed sacrifice cults around, but there's still some.
Oh yeah.
But not lots. It's weird how many people keep a secret that they've joined a new group of friends. It's like some people do recognize that there's something weird about this group, but they're willing to bite the bullet and keep moving forward with it.
I don't know. I don't talk about my friends to my other friends. You know, I have like chunks of friends,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't talk about you to my other groups of friends.
But when something big happens in your life, we talk about it.
Oh yeah.
And a change in your religious life. I mean, I understand like why a lot of people don't share their changes in their religious life with everybody they know, but friends, if they're close, will usually mention this sort of thing.
Yeah.
But I guess follow through this idea. If people are typically recruiting for cults from people who are in really hard positions in their life, maybe the more preyed upon people are those who wouldn't have others to tell. That might be part of it.
Okay. Look at us and our self-discovery. I have a note in the notes. There's a bullet point in the notes of cults that aren't harmful. As I mentioned, all religions start as cults. All offshoots of major religions, all major religions start as cults. Every denomination of Christianity started as a cult. And we don't look at Church of England as a cult of Henry VIII anymore. We just look at it as another denomination. And I think that's because it was allowed to establish itself. They didn't have...
Allowed to establish itself. It was founded by the
Fair.
king. Not that it's the worst example. It's just you have a very powerful, charismatic leader.
That's true. I mean, we could pick on Hutterites or something then, or Anabaptists and Quakers. They were allowed to establish themselves. And I mean, Church of England is a good example because their beliefs weren't too crazy, minus divorce, which is really, we all know that was the only reason Church of England was developed. And where am I going with this? So we look at something like Christianity, which was a cult of Judaism. And obviously in the first century, they were persecuted, but eventually they took root and it's now a very acceptable religion. It's
the standard of all of America, not just South America. It's weird if you're not a Catholic.
Yeah. So I just wonder if sometimes in the world we live in with media and social media, if we create dangerous cults when there was no dangerous cult to begin with, it was just an offshoot.
Oh, for sure. There's, as we'll talk about later, there's a really strong us versus them thing that's really thrust upon you in most cults. it's not absent from most Western religions.
So I'm going to touch on this. Disclaimer, all of my research is literally from the Netflix documentary. I did a little bit of supplementary reading for this episode, and I'm sure we'll do a full episode. But the Rajneeshi movement is a group of sannyasins, which is a group of Hindus, and they originate in India with their founder Rajneesh. I was going to find his first name, but I didn't write it down. Bhagwan Rajneesh. Bhagwan is a title, just like Christ is a title. And
it's interesting to me that this sannyasin group is the same group that Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, came from.
Absolutely, yeah. And they had a big sect in India, and they wanted to start communal living. And they had people from all over the world coming to India for this group. And so they bought acres of land in Oregon in the United States, outside of a small town called Antelope. Now, for literally, I think it's like a 6-episode documentary. Literally the first 4 episodes, I'm like, they're not doing anything wrong. It's the people in Antelope who are going to make this worse.
White people suck.
So the Rajneeshis, they wear all red and orange. They're very they had like South Asian people, but also white people, but very distinct looking just because they all wore the same thing. And they were, like I said, trying to build a self-sustaining commune outside of this small town. And small town, less than 100 people, small town. And they didn't like it. And the Rajneeshis started buying homes in the town so that they could get an electoral vote to lessen some of the pressures on them from the community. And they interviewed these people, and they're like, oh, they started buying the houses. I'm like, you were selling the houses. Why are you mad at them? Someone has to sell a house for someone to be able to buy a house.
Well, and when you're selling a house, you have the option to not sell it to somebody who's offering to buy.
Mm-hmm.
That's true of all sales, pretty much. Though, in the digital age, there's a lot less of opportunity to see who is buying. But you still have the option.
Yeah. So it's just really, like I said, the first 4 episodes, it really feels like these people are just scared of other and making it really hard on them. And I honestly think that if they had just left well enough alone, it wouldn't have escalated the way it did. I'm sure it would have ended at some point just because people get disillusioned. You're living in a commune in the 90s in Oregon. I'm sure when smartphones hit, people would have left.
Maybe that depends on how much they value what they have in their community. If everything you think you need is there,
true.
Do you even need a smartphone?
Yes, to listen to this podcast.
You can listen to this podcast through your browser on your laptop, can't you?
That's true.
See, you
Fair.
don't need a smartphone.
That's fair. Anyway, long story short, both the townspeople and the Rajneeshi and the commune started arming themselves, and there was a political race to get votes, and it escalated into the largest poisoning in American history. So it absolutely did become a violent, scary cult that we think of. But I encourage you to go watch the first few episodes and really look at it. Is this a scary group of people, or is this just someone trying to start a new way of life for themselves?
What's the name of this show?
Wild Wild Country. Thank you. I hadn't said it yet. Wild Wild Country. I don't actually know if it's still on Netflix, but it was really good. Highly recommend it.
It's probably still on Netflix. Netflix does a lot of their own documentaries.
I think it is a Netflix documentary. Also, the organization around the Rajneeshi, and this is again from the 90s in Oregon, Osho International, is still in existence today. OSHO.com. So you can still, like I said, they're still around today. Not the commune, obviously, because that ended badly, but the ideologies of the Bhagwan are alive and well.
Yeah, they're still popular in the United States and Australia and all over Europe.
Interesting.
Yeah. Kind kind of weird that what used to be labeled very publicly as this cult that makes people uncomfortable is now another, I want to say world religion, but I mean, we've discussed this. I don't like the label to begin with, but it is all over the world, though it's not huge. It's around.
I was at a Tony Robbins conference, and I'm pretty sure I was like the only one in the entire room that was like, but he mentioned doing like meeting with Bhagwan, and I was like, and everyone was like, Bhagwan!
Tony Robbins, super charismatic guy, but as far as I can tell, people aren't afraid to leave him.
That's
though
where
there is a sunk cost thing that it also gets in people's head too.
I think Tony Robbins is a good guy because he could have a cult like that and he hasn't done it yet.
Right?
So respect.
Right?
Because he could. Like tomorrow he could be like, we're flying to Guyana and I got a drink for you. And
Right.
people would be like, okay, Tony.
He's only a stone's throw away from Nexium, but he doesn't throw that stone.
He has not branded anyone yet or sold anyone into sex trafficking. So
It's
good guy,
great.
Tony Robbins. Yeah. I feel like I'm going to have to post a good guy, Tony Robbins meme in the Discord.
Sure.
I'm going to have to probably make it, but it's fine.
That's okay.
Preston, I'm going to hand it over to you for a little bit with, of course, my charming interjections about the bite model. I love the bite model. I'm so excited. It's kind of dumb that I'm excited about it, but the bite model is basically how you tell if something's a cult. And Preston's going to break it down for us. Wicca, wicca.
Yeah, it's actually a really well thought out way to evaluate religions or even non-religious groups. Like even Bhagwan's cult group, he kind of sold it as a religious less religion, which, I mean, that's such a nonsense phrase that
Para-religion?
yeah, it was a para-religious group basically born out of that sannyasin tradition that was really digestible in a way that did appeal to people that were outside of the Hindu tradition, which is kind of nifty. But yeah, back into this BITE model. So BITE stands for behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. So we're going to look at these different items and look at how they affect people, I guess, in
I
their
will
different facets.
say if you're interested, it is quite extensive. We've summarized it.
Yeah, I've managed to crunch this down into small enough bites that
Bites, I get it. You did it.
All right, so the first is behavior control. The big summary of this whole idea is that cults discourage individualism with rigid rules. So they regulate associations, they tell you who you can hang out with, and sometimes force you to be isolated. They also regulate your clothing, your hairstyles, your diet, up into things like perpetual hunger or long-term fasting. It's a little bit more intense than just saying don't eat pork. It's like straight up, you don't get to eat for a while, which is a huge problem. They'll also regulate your sleep. They'll make you sleep weird hours sometimes. Sometimes they'll straight up deprive you from sleep just to regulate your behavior, which counts as torture.
Well, and also regulating sleep in particular makes you more suggestible to things.
Yeah.
For sure. Or so tired that you actually can't think straight, right? We've all been that tired, unfortunately.
For sure.
So yeah, regulating sleep is a huge red flag because
Big power move.
Yep.
They'll also typically restrict your leisure and entertainment, which sounds not too crazy. Like most churches don't want you going to strip clubs
Or watching pornography. Or
right. Or even sometimes they'll like, don't watch PG-13 movies. Definitely don't watch rated R
Don't read
movies.
Harry Potter. It's the devil.
Yeah. So they'll go typically beyond that to the point where they actually control what you have opportunities to receive as entertainment material, and they will restrict your leisure time, which that kind of control is where it gets a little bit scary. I think.
Yes, and I this is big in groups that either are communal, where you're supposed to work for the group, or request a lot of volunteer hours from you. And it's kind of the same thing as
Mhm.
the sleep thing, where you're too busy to stop and think about what's going on.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. In fact, the too busy to think about what's going on kind of
It's a
shows up in
recurring
all
theme.
4 of these themes.
And also an important one because it goes beyond religious cults, right? So you think
Absolutely.
of something like Nexium, or Nexium is the big one I can think of. I can't think of any others right now, but
It's a pretty good example of a recent, not quite religious cult, though.
Yeah.
So it's pretty fine that it
I'll
keeps
just,
coming to mind.
okay, I'll just keep going to Nexium then. Again, where you're just too busy to be like, I was branded with an iron this week. Ouch.
Maybe I should run away.
Ouch.
Nah.
No, I got this shit to do.
All right. Another part of behavioral control that you'll see in a lot of cults is financial exploitation, where people will ask you for literally all of the money you have, usually incrementally, but they will make you poor to make the group or the leader of the group exclusively very wealthy. But there's also more than just financial exploitation. There's also building financial dependence, which is why they don't just recruit the rich. They'll also recruit anybody who they can force into a position where they rely on the group for their financial needs, which of course is a problem.
I think they would actually have a harder time, and I don't know what statistics are, but actually getting very wealthy people into a cult, because very wealthy people tend to have financial planners. And at some point,
Pretty often.
your financial planner would go,
Right?
mine would holler on.
But see, a lot of these people who would have financial planners, if they're halfway into a cult and they're pretty committed already, they're a lot of the time they're happier to leave their financial planner
That's true.
behind than leave their group. So a financial planner can be very helpful, but only if you actually value their advice,
Fair.
which is true in literally every scenario. And just generally, cults will typically manipulate you financially. One way or the other, they're going to manipulate you.
Can I have $5?
If I had $5,
You would.
I would be willing to give you $5 if you needed it.
Here starts
Though
my
I
career.
suspect that since you are more regularly employed than I am, that you don't need the $5 that I don't have as bad as I
I'll
do.
look after you if you give me $5.
You know what? At this point in my life, you've got a deal.
Ooh, it's starting, guys. I'm so proud.
We'll see where this goes.
Okay.
Also, something that is almost universally used in the danger cults, as far as behavior control, is the idea of rewards and punishments to modify behavior. The carrot versus the stick both get used an awful lot. It's never just the carrot, but it's never just the stick. There's an awful lot of torture. You can be beaten, you can be burned, branded, or tattooed. Cutting is not outside the realm of what is common. And sometimes rape. Weirdly enough, there's enough cults that have been around where people have been forced to rape other people, which is the kind of thing where you should know at this point that you need to leave this group. And an awful lot of people will stay with the group beyond that point. Not cool.
Nope.
You are also compelled to torture other people in other ways as well. And sometimes, as we have seen in other handful of documentaries about, say, Scientology, you can be compelled to murder somebody.
Who's been murdered in Scientology?
Oh, there's a long list.
Oh, actually, I do know one. I can't remember her name, but I do know one case in particular that you're talking about. We're what's that term for us now? for people who are enemies of Scientology?
I don't remember.
But we're them now
Yeah, we are.
because we just
We
said
have spoken
something
out against
publicly.
Scientology.
Cool. I'm going to spend the rest of the episode thinking about it.
There's a word. Oh, well.
Move on to I, and I'll Google it.
All right. Another big control move in cults is information control. Moving on to that second letter of our bite. So information control is about discouraging criticism, typically with misinformation, and also preventing other important information from reaching the adherents. Did you find your word?
I did. We're suppressive
Yes.
persons now.
I'm okay with that.
Okay.
So information control, usually, well, I'm not going to say usually, pretty much always. I'm not aware of a situation where one of these dangerous cults doesn't use deception, where information is deliberately withheld or distorted to render the collective group more acceptable to the individual. This will include systematic lying and use of non-cult sources out of context or outright misquoting people to make the group seem better than they really are. Usually they will limit your access to outside information. Like, don't use the internet. It's full of lies. Fake
Scientologists
news.
aren't allowed to Google Scientology.
That doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah.
So you need to limit people's access to information that would make them at all question the group or their place in it. You need to keep members too busy to think or access information as well. So, like I said, that theme's going to carry through. There it is. Also, there's a strong tendency to encourage spying and have people report on each other when they see deviant behavior or even questions that seem a little too invasive.
It's very effective because once you know there's this tattletale system in place, like if you're told to tattle on someone, you know that someone could tattle on you. So it's just as
Absolutely.
like, you might never actually tell on someone, but it,
You know somebody will if you step
yeah,
out of
so
line.
it just like, there's like a word I'm trying to think. It just like automatically keeps people in line without actually necessarily having to do anything.
Right?
Just to know that it's a possibility
Mhm.
keeps people in line.
Fear is the number one tool of cult leaders. And this is where it's pretty visible, I think. Because, of course, people want to avoid torture, which is a perfectly natural
Unless you're
state.
a, what is it, sadist, masochist? I get them
Masochist.
backwards all the time. Unless you're a masochist.
Yeah. Also, in part of this whole reporting on each other, there's also the unethical use of confession. Like if you go to confess to your pastor or priest or whatever, that could be problematic, but usually isn't. In the bigger churches that typically are led by believers, as opposed to how I said most cults are led by people who don't actually believe what they're teaching in a lot of cases. So these cases of unethical use of confession will typically disrupt or outright dissolve your identity boundaries, which can be terrifying to somebody who is able to see what's going on. There's also commonly used tools of memory manipulation, which is
gaslighting.
I mean, yeah, that's a connected thing for sure. Making somebody question what they think they know is sometimes problematic. If what they think...
I think it's questioning people's experiences.
Yeah.
Right? That's the problem. You know, having a healthy debate about religion or politics, I don't think is a problem. But to say, no, that wasn't your experience is a huge problem.
Absolutely. And the last point I have here for unethical use of confession is withholding forgiveness. For those in the Christian tradition, it's typically understood that confession is connected to forgiveness, that you can receive forgiveness through confession. There may or may not be extra steps involved, depending on what you've done, but outright withholding forgiveness after confession is a problem. Moving on to the third part of our bite model.
T.
Go for it. What do you got?
I just wanted to say T like a cheerleader. And
Oh,
I'm
okay.
making T. People can't see me, but I'm making a T like a cheerleader.
Well done.
Thank you. You did all the research. I'll just chime in with my thoughts.
Honestly, I wasn't even aware of the bite model until you brought it up to me.
I know, but you still did all the research.
But I did dig deeply into it to understand it. I don't know why that was so hard to say.
You almost said I did dick deeply, and I was a little concerned there.
Yeah, that's none of your business.
Oh.
All right. The third thing is thought control. So you can ensure continued obedience by eliminating the individual. You do this by messing with their power to think. And so this is usually seen when cults require members to adopt doctrine as truth, which realistically, almost every group, political, religious, or theatrical, there is things that you should believe to be an effective part of the community.
Yeah, even any mainstream Christian group is not down if you don't accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior, right? Like that's cost of entry.
Yeah. But if you are required to believe that everything that is said must be true, with the fear of punishment if you don't, you've got serious problems. And usually these include a really strict us versus them, good versus evil, everything is black or white. Cults don't typically like playing around with allowing you to believe that there's a gray zone. You're either with the group or you're against the group. Which, I mean, is pretty much true of the dangerous groups anyway.
Yes, cult or otherwise, yes. And as we know, it's a spectrum.
It is.
Everything. Like, did I make a clear point?
I think you did.
Okay.
Everything is a spectrum. There is gray. It's not just black and white.
I was like, did you think I was referring to like cults on a spectrum or belief on? I was talking about belief on a spectrum.
All the things.
Oh,
all the things exist on a spectrum.
Okay. I've just made this weird.
Anyway. Very often, cults will require their members to take on a new name and identity. I knew a lady when I was living in New Jersey. Her name was Marjorie. She was an awesome lady. She fed us all the time. Super funny, jolly lady. Had a lot of fun hanging out with her. And when she was hanging out with Malcolm X, she lost her last name. She became Marjorie number X, because the first person in the group gets to be X, and the second person with that same first name would be 2X, and then 3X. It's kind of weird. I learned that from her because she was an interesting lady who was willing to share her experiences. Not that Malcolm X would be classified as a dangerous cult leader by all standards, but by some people, he absolutely was.
Yeah.
And he definitely employed this method of giving people new names and adjusting their identities. Another common factor is hypnosis, to help you alter your mental states or also undermine critical thought. Kind of a huge problem there. Even worse is the idea of causing age regression deliberately. That's a really effective way to make people rely on you. If you can put them in the state of mind of a 6-year-old, they have to look up to you as the provider. Huge problem.
Yeah, that's terrifying.
Yeah, it's very scary. And also very often they'll use hypnosis to alter your memories or create entirely new ones.
I don't know if you have this on here, but drugs use as well for the same thing. I
don't have that on the list, but drugs are very useful tools in this hypnosis program. Because usually drugs on their own won't do the things, but if you combine it with hypnosis, you're going to get a lot of work done.
Yeah, if you could put people in states of paranoia or whatever, With drugs, yeah.
Oh yeah, especially if you think if you can get people to think that everyone is out to get them outside of the group and really make them feel safe in the group, you've got a believer for life, probably. Yeah. Another thing that is commonly used to control thought is helping people to control their own thoughts with techniques that help them to rationalize where they're at and stop all intrusive thoughts from coming at them before they really can take root. This will usually include chanting or repetitive prayers. Meditating can be effective, but if you've ever tried to sit down for 5 minutes and not think at all, it's really hard to do. And that does actually allow intrusive thoughts to come unless you've gotten really good at meditating in a way that you are able to let those intrusive thoughts go rather than hold on to them when they come.
I think if you're that mindful, you wouldn't be in a cult.
One would hope.
But I don't know. If you're out there and you're that mindful and you're in a cult,
let us know.
Can you email me?
Tell us how that worked out. Yeah, meditating is a weird thing to be on this list, but it is on the list. That the practice of forcing thoughts out of your mind, which most people think of when they think of meditation, is the kind of meditation that is espoused by these cults.
I think some of it is like probably run through the idea that God can hear your thoughts. So if you have any doubts,
push them out.
Better get out, because I mean, obviously in the context of religious cults, or that the leader can hear your thoughts or whatever. And if they can hear that you have doubts, then you can be the next one getting beaten.
Yeah, so you have to suppress those thoughts. Another thing that comes up a lot is speaking in tongues, which is a thing that you'll see an awful lot in especially evangelical and Pentecostal churches, that they serve a different purpose. They typically are outward signs when you see them in churches, but in cults, it's more of a business of putting nonsense in your head and making you spout nonsense, because when your mouth is engaged, typically your brain isn't engaged in something different.
Yeah.
So kind of helpful. I wouldn't class it as one of the more powerful tools, but it is a tool that is used because it is effective. And of course, singing and humming, a nice way to keep the group unified and thinking about what their mouth is engaged in.
Yeah.
Next on the list, we have the idea that you just have to reject critical thinking, which basically outright, I have to implore everybody to never do.
Always think critically.
You can avoid a lot of problems by thinking critically. This includes actually analyzing things rationally, absolutely prevented as much as possible by these groups. And they will outright forbid criticism. You don't get to criticize the leader. It's not your place. And you should stop thinking about things like that, or you're going to get yourself in trouble.
I wouldn't do well in a cult.
That's a good thing.
Unless I was the leader of one.
We'll see how that works.
We'll see how that goes. We'll see if I get that $5 from Preston.
But yeah, the number one thing, I need to stop clapping my hands. The number one thing is that you have to label all thought that is outside of what is acceptable as unacceptable.
Wow.
That's an annoying tautology. Let's try that again. Every other thought not expressly given to you by the collective or the leader is unacceptable.
Unacceptable. I was trying to say it at the same time as you because I knew what you were going to say. Didn't work.
Very nice.
Thanks.
And the fourth letter in this bite.
E.
Emotional control. That you can establish dependence by manipulating emotions. So the idea that somebody can mess with your emotions a little bit scary. And people do it on the regular.
I think you have to be incredibly self-aware to not have people mess with your emotions,
I
even
think
just
so.
as a regular human being.
For sure.
But yeah, so I think this one's probably a very effective tool.
Absolutely. Usually you'll see the idea that this group is a family, and they'll play that up really hard, because when you think of family, hopefully you're thinking of positive emotions and that you can establish long-lasting positive connections with people. And that's exactly what they want to have happen in these cults.
Also important if you didn't come from a good family, because we all have that idea of family drilled into us. Right? So it works both ways. Like if you had a great family, then this is just another family. If you didn't have a good family, then this is
This
the
is
one
the
for
good
you.
family.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's a messed up way to
it is.
play around with people, but it works.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably the strongest tool in their belt,
Mm-hmm.
is the idea that you can depend on them like a family. And so part of this emotional control that you'll see is that some emotions are outright banned as evil or selfish, and that people's emotions should be blocked, especially homesickness and doubt. The idea that your emotions can be evil and selfish and need to be suppressed by all means is something that I think is really not cool. I'm really uncomfortable with it.
It's really unhealthy.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as a bad emotion.
Like, even rage.
Anger has its place.
Anger has its place. There's obviously appropriate uses of your emotions and inappropriate uses, conversely. But to say an emotion is outright evil or selfish is hugely problematic.
I think a lot of mental health problems happen because we don't let ourselves feel the full spectrum of emotion.
I think you're probably right.
So this is really bad advice.
Right. Often these cults will make members feel like problems are their own fault rather than the fault of the leader or the group, even if they are, in fact, completely constructed problems outside of your own control.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a really awful way to try and control somebody.
Mm-hmm.
They'll also typically promote feelings of shame or guilt or unworthiness, and especially fear, to make you feel bad, so that when they make you feel good, there's a lot more weight on that. Especially the fear that they would give you of independent thought, fear of the world, fear of enemies, fear of damnation is fairly common, and fear of group disapproval.
The worst.
Yeah. You want to be accepted by the group that you're trying to belong to. And since a person in a cult doesn't recognize the dangers of belonging to that group, that disapproval is hugely problematic. And so that fear is a great controlling tool. They will also often, I mentioned that there's the misuse of confession. Public confession of sins is pretty much never appropriate, I think, but it's often used by cults to control people. That if you do something bad, you'll have to say it in front of everybody. Don't do it.
I don't like that.
Right? So emotional manipulation can also be those orchestrated highs and lows, that love bombing that you had mentioned earlier, contrasted with harsh condemnation, but also shunning friends who leave, controlling the way you feel about people that you were told were your family. Once they've left the group, you can never talk to them again. They're awful. They're the enemy. That's not okay.
No. You can't tell me who to love.
Right? There's also the idea that you can generate fear of what life would be outside the group. Now that you've been here, how could you ever survive outside again?
Well, that actually is a real problem. There's
Yeah.
people who help people transition out of cults. So yeah, that actually is of the threats they make, that one is actually a very real threat.
For sure. And it's deliberately constructed, which is a problem.
Yeah.
They do deliberately make you fear that, which probably makes the transition harder.
Yeah.
And the idea that you have to be afraid of all outsiders because they're either weak and will drag you down, or they're outright evil and will tear you up. That's a really harmful way to see the world. And this will also include threats of harm to ex-members, that they will be physically punished just because they've left.
Yep.
That fear of leaving is, like I said, one of the big problems. Yeah, and that's the bite model.
Cool. I have some follow-up questions / thoughts that I wanted to discuss. I think, I don't know how to word this. I think that, especially when you look at the full bite model, which I encourage you to do.
So the bite model is constructed by Stephen Hassan, and it's his bite model of authoritarian control is actually what it is. But authoritarian control is how you lead a cult. So we've made that application here. And you can find it in greater detail on freedomofmind.com.
Cool. Thanks, Preston. I'm trying to think of the best way to word this. But basically, like you said, especially when you look at the full bite model, there are points on the bite model that apply to major religions.
Oh, for sure. We've got things on here that I would call orange buttons and red buttons.
And I think there's a quantity of buttons, too.
Yes, absolutely. If you check off 90% of these boxes, you're in a bad spot. But if you only check off 2 of these things, and they're the things that I would label as low risk as opposed to the higher risk things.
I guess this is part of the critical thinking, is that if you're a member of any religious organization or charismatic group with a leader, to evaluate the bite model for yourself. Can something check the boxes and not be dangerous? Or I guess, what's the tipping point for a cult? You know what I mean? Like, if I am personally getting something out of it, doesn't matter that it ticks, or when does it matter that it ticks the boxes?
Well, see, if you're getting something out of it and you are able to recognize that it ticks off 90% of what I'll call the red button boxes, what is your position in this group?
Well, we were having this conversation the other day when we were writing these notes. It's like Tom Cruise and Scientology. Either he hasn't looked at it critically, which is a possibility, or he has looked at it critically, but either one of 2 things. One, they have so much on him, which is a very real possibility, and then it's dangerous for him. Or 2, he has so much power, he doesn't care that it ticks all these boxes.
Right. It's a little scary.
And I think of other mainstream religions that have huge numbers of congregants, followers, believers that tick a lot of these boxes.
Well, and you'll have groups that the larger group might not tick some of these boxes, but your subgroup does. And that, like, it could be your family that puts these pressures on you.
Yep, absolutely.
And that the church doesn't at all.
Right.
You've got all kinds of tiered spectrum-wise problems.
I don't know how much we want to name names or name churches. I mean, we have no problem being contentious. But, like, okay, the one I'm thinking of is Jehovah's Witness. Right? Where they have millions of members worldwide, but they tick a lot of these boxes.
They really do.
And I think if you asked the average person on the street, they might go, well, I don't want a Jehovah's Witness at my door, but they probably wouldn't identify it as a cult.
Right.
Just a kind of weird group of Christians. So, like, I guess my question is that a problem? Is it not a problem? When does it become a problem? Are you
one of those
picking up
things
what
that
I'm laying down? You just can't answer it.
there's no singular answer, I think. It's tricky. Critical thought is hugely important. Yeah, and evaluating things on a case by case basis is necessary, I think.
I also think part of it is why we do this podcast, which I also talked about last week, is being able to question those in power and make change in your own organization, religious or otherwise. I guess in the case of Jehovah's Witnesses in particular, just because I don't mean to pick on them, but they're an easy example right now, is with such with such a large membership, if they could create a large enough movement to create change within the church to uncheck some of these boxes.
For sure.
It would just, it needs education and critical thinking to even know that the boxes are checked, I guess, is where the problem comes in. And, in the case of Tom Cruise and Scientology, he might not even know what boxes are checked, right? Because he's so powerful. He probably doesn't even hear half the horror stories from Scientology.
Unless he's in an actual position of authority within the church, it's perfectly reasonable that he could be unaware of a lot of these problems.
He's like number 2 to like David Miscavige, only because he's so famous. And he's brought a lot of people in because it's Tom Cruise being a Scientologist. But
But is he a revered figure or is he actually an authoritative figure?
I don't know if he has any.
Like, he might not have administrative authority at all. I don't know.
He's like Fen level 8 or something, or 10. He's like the highest you can go. He's clear.
Well, yeah, he can definitely afford all those classes.
Right. Yeah, so that was a really big question that we didn't really answer, but important for people to think about in whatever organization it is, even if you're in a local Lions Club, to evaluate what the community's doing in your world.
For sure. So what are some glaring red flags for cults outside of what we've already discussed?
The bite model, I didn't add a ton because the bite model is a very good overview. Again, it's hard as we'll never know what someone else is thinking or believing or fully going through. So I wanted to give a few red flags for people, for loved ones. Again, it's hard because you might not know the full extent of either their beliefs or what the organization is doing. Preston put this one on the list, is guns. Because we were talking about the Branch Davidians.
There's so much discussion on whether or not the law enforcement was legitimately called to start this siege in the compound outside Waco, Texas, years and years ago. And the idea of a religious group stockpiling guns,
which they did legally, but still they
didn't break the law in collecting these guns as far as I can have been informed. But the idea of a religious society collecting a huge number of firearms,
it's a red flag.
A big red flag.
So. Another one I found is sharing theories and beliefs that are out of character.
Now, what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, Preston, as a atheist who has studied a lot of religion, if I came to you one day and started telling you very excitedly about my new religious beliefs, that'd probably be a red flag.
Yes, it would. So. I would definitely have questions for you, that's for sure.
And then if I start talking about the great and sexy leader of this group and how much I just love him so much and he's just inspired me to change my life, another red flag.
Right. Now, it doesn't mean that people can't make useful and productive big changes of heart, but think critically.
Well, and for a while there, I was rabbit holing. I was going down the rabbit hole on YouTube for Muslim conversion stories. Mm-hmm. And none of them are like, I woke up and decided to be Muslim. They're all like, I thought about this for a really long time and I read the Quran and I talked to all my friends who were Muslim and I talked to family about what they would think if I converted to Islam. And Yeah. So it doesn't
Rapid
have
change is
rapid
weird.
change would be really weird.
Mhm.
And of the handful of videos I've watched on it on YouTube, it's typically Caucasian people. And a lot of them talk about how they're concerned about telling their family and friends. So if someone's just like rip roaring ready to go, I'm a fill in the blank now. And it's something you haven't heard of. That's
That's a red flag.
That's a red flag. Again, any sort of exploitation, this came up in the bite model and also might be hard for you as a loved one to know, but financial, sexual exploitation. You might hear about financial exploitation more than sexual exploitation, but
But they both happen.
totally. But I think someone might be like, hey, I'm broke or I can't afford that more than they
Mhm.
say that they've been trafficked.
Right.
And then again, that's scared to leave.
You can't really emphasize that one enough.
No. If people are scared to leave the group, it's not a good group.
Yeah. If they're scared to leave, you need to help them leave.
We'll get you a new passport. And we'll get
I
your
mean,
name
that's
changed.
a tricky thing to do.
I know.
Changing names, I mean, it's cheap enough to do. I don't think it's terribly quick, but it's cheap.
Yeah.
$200 here anyway.
All right. Well, good to know. I don't know why you know that. Yeah, those are the red flags I could find for you helping a loved one. And again, falling back on that bite model, as well as a really good guide for both yourself if you're evaluating a group or if you have a loved one you're concerned about.
Yeah. The International Cultic Studies Association has a definition for destructive cults, which
Danger cult, as Preston's been calling it.
yeah, I like to call them danger cults. They're slightly more, it's a little broader bracket than destructive cults. Destructive cults is defined by the International Cultic Studies Association as a highly manipulative group which exploits and sometimes physically and or psychologically damages members and recruits.
I like it.
Yeah,
I think that's the best one we've had.
It's pretty solid. I like it. My phone's been alerting me to potentially more discussion on what definitions might show up.
Oh, right. Preston put out
I've asked a
APB.
few people.
For scholarly definitions of cults, because as we said, there's the cult in the sense of a baby religion and the cult in the sense of NXIVM.
Yeah, I've asked a handful of people to specifically have them not look up a definition, but to define it from what they are able to observe in what they think are cults. So I've got one fella saying, I would say a small to large group of individuals controlled by a charismatic individual or board of individuals in a situation wherein the group has a slavish and unquestioning dedication to that individual or that board of individuals.
Interesting.
It's pretty solid.
I like the term
it.
slavish because that basically encapsulates the bite model.
It does. It's a nice short way to cover up everything we've talked
Everything.
about.
We literally could have just read that sentence for this episode and been done.
Mm-hmm. For some people, a cult is a group of persons that have a common interest or belief in a common unusual thing or person or religion. The only problem I have with that is what constitutes unusual.
I agree because, like I said, they all just branch off of other bigger things.
Usually, there's not a whole lot of new, novel religious thought.
No, there's some, and I guess you would call them cults in the sense of small groups around charismatic leaders, not necessarily dangerous ones, likening it to early Christianity, is you probably get some neo-paganism or neo-Wiccan, but even that is based in, I don't actually know if a brand new idea would catch. And we'll kind of talk about this in our next episode.
I mean, the flying spaghetti monster was pretty new.
But well, I was going to say we're going to talk about this next, but that was based off of
existing ideas. Yeah.
If the flying spaghetti monster came out with entirely new doctrine, I don't think it would catch.
No, it
And
wouldn't.
and flying spaghetti monster hasn't caught for the same reasons as other religions either. Next week, 2 weeks from now, rather, satirical religions. We're gonna jump off of cults and go into a weird realm of satire religions.
Yeah. It'll be a great discussion and a lot of fun, I think.
Mm-hmm. Any final thoughts on cults?
Don't join cults.
One of us, one of us, one of us. Those
us.
are my final thoughts. I just wanted to chant it one more time.
Generally, just avoid any group that would subvert your individual free will, I think is ultimately the takeaway from this discussion.
Thanks, Preston. Are we pimping ourselves now?
Yeah, let's do it.
Cool. Facebook, Instagram at Holy Watermelon Pod. Email holywatermelonpod@gmail.com. Discord, find it on our social media sites. And leave 5 stars on Apple.
I think that's all of them.
Cool.
Thanks for joining us.
Peace be with you.
By the late Middle Ages, the Christian prophecy had fulfilled itself.
God is near.